Thanks for joining us today for our ACFE monthly podcast, FraudTalk. My name is Mandy Moody, and I am the ACFE Social Media Specialist, and I will be speaking with Jacob Parks today. Jacob is our research specialist here, and he recently did a presentation on Bitcoin fraud and what it is, what's coming in the future, and what's going on right now. So I thought it'd be a good topic to explore today. So welcome, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's just dive right in, and let's start at the beginning. I know Bitcoin is pretty foreign to a lot of people right now. What is it exactly, and where did it come from?
It's a digital currency, and what that means is that it's all traded digitally. It doesn't have any sort of physical manifestation, or at least it doesn't require any physical manifestation. But it's not like some other things that people think of when they think of digital transactions, like a PayPal transaction. You know, some people, oh, is that a digital currency? Well, not in the same way that Bitcoin is. PayPal is still using underlying currencies like the dollar or the euro to function. So, you know, you can pay someone with PayPal, but it's still using some other currency. Bitcoin, though, doesn't necessarily need to have a dollar linked to it. It's not related to the dollar. You can send someone Bitcoins and it's like sending them money, and there's no financial institution that has to be involved. And so it's a standalone currency. As it turns out, most people end up exchanging it for a different type of currency in the end. It's more common for it to be used as a transfer of value than it is for transactions. But there are some merchants and things and other parties who will accept Bitcoin, kind of like you would accept a debit card transaction or a credit card transaction, but using your mobile phone or using the internet or some other way. And so there have been a lot of digital currencies over the years. They've been around since the early 90s, really. But Bitcoin is special in a few ways, and that's kind of how it's gotten its popularity, is because it's overcome some of the problems that previous digital currencies had. And so when you think about it, a digital currency, what's to stop people from just copying the currency and sending, like double spending, basically, sending people more money than actually exists, more digital copies of that money. And so Bitcoin has a way to get around that, and it uses an encryption system to do so. And so instead of some of these other currencies, another key fact of Bitcoin is that it's completely decentralized. And what that means is that instead of a central business or a central bank or whatever hosting all of this information on a single computer, like a server that you would have, like, you know, Google or whatever internet service provider has a bunch of servers in their location, and they host all this, you know, people accessing their website or people doing transactions. It's all hosted centrally. But with Bitcoin, the users who use Bitcoin actually form the network. And so it's this network that supports transactions, verifies transactions, and actually forms the Bitcoin system. And so where you've seen other digital currencies that have had problems with law enforcement. For instance, we saw e-gold, which was a digital currency that was basically tied to gold. And so, you know, X number of e-gold units was worth like an ounce of gold. And so, but this was all centrally located, and they didn't properly register with money laundering regulators and things like that. And so they were shut down. And so there have been some concerns with Bitcoin for money laundering and other crimes like that. But since it's decentralized, there's no one to shut down, because you would have to shut down every user who's using the Bitcoin system. And that's not feasible, because these people are all over the world. And so, you know, that's one sort of avoidance of regulation.
And a new one could pop up just as soon as one closes, right?
Right. I mean, there's thousands, 10,000s of these computers up. And so as long as some of them are operating, I mean, that's the Bitcoin system. And so that's one way. And so it's prevented double spending. It's prevented, or at least to some extent, prevented regulation. So the federal government or whatever government can't just go in and shut it down easily anyway. And it's also has controls for inflation. So there's a number of Bitcoins that can be created. So 21 million Bitcoins can be created over time. But in order to create Bitcoins, in order to get them, you have to mine them. You have to run this software program on your computer, and it will try to solve this cryptographic puzzle. And once it solves it, it rewards that user with a number of Bitcoins. Right now it's 25 Bitcoins for solving one of these puzzles. and they get harder and harder to solve as it goes along. And so this controls inflation because there's only so many that can be made, and it's harder and harder to create them as time goes by.
The computer is solving them, right?
Yes.
This isn't like something where you go on and like Pac-Man and play and it gets harder and harder and harder. Your computer is actually the one solving them and giving and awarding you the Bitcoins, right?
Yes. I mean, I kind of use the metaphor as like a puzzle board. Like you're trying to solve this puzzle board. The only difference is it's not actually a human puzzle. It's a puzzle designed for computers, basically, using encryption. And so, at this point, it takes a lot of computer power to do this. So you'll see, type in Bitcoin miners and images in Google, and you'll see just rooms full of computers that are just stacked on top of each other, and they're all trying to unlock these Bitcoins because they're valuable and because they can sell them for cash or use them for transaction purposes. And so, I mean, the technology of it is kind of complex, and you would really need a software programming background to fully understand what was going on there. But for purposes of just sort of a model, kind of think of Bitcoins like a digital form of gold, in that gold is valuable as a currency because it has longevity. It's not going to rust or go away or degrade. Also because it's rare. That's really why gold is so valuable as a currency, because you can't just make more of it easily. There's only so much of it. And Bitcoins are kind of the same way. So they're durable. You can't copy them easily. You can't present fakes very easily. And also, there's only so many of them to go around, and so that kind of gives them that value. As there's only so many, so we can price them. They're not infinite.
Is this something for the layman? Like, could I go home tonight, download the software, and get some, or is it strictly for people that are software savvy?
Yeah. Well, I think the whole mining process probably isn't for the general person, but you can also buy Bitcoins. The way that most people will end up getting Bitcoins is to buy them from a currency exchanger, and there's all sorts of these, hundreds of these currency exchangers across the world, and you just give them money and they turn it into Bitcoins, or if you have Bitcoins, you give them Bitcoins and they'll turn it into money, and they can transfer it to a bank account. And so these are kind of the most common organizations that handle Bitcoins are these currency exchangers. They're sort of the choke points, because while you can use Bitcoins to buy things, it's kind of limited. There's not a whole lot of merchants that accept them, but it's growing. So you can use them in and of themselves. But like I said, more often than not right now, that it's used as a way to transfer funds than to buy things with.
Tell me where this all came from. How was the first Bitcoin established?
Well, it's kind of mysterious. We don't actually know who created Bitcoin. There's a person or a group of persons named Satoshi Nakamoto, which is a Japanese name, but everyone's tried to look up who is this person, and it's just a pseudonym. This person doesn't actually exist, at least no one with that name. And so we don't really know who did it, and they've done a pretty good job at covering their tracks.
And what year did this name pop up?
In 2009, someone released a white paper, which is a research paper explaining how this digital currency would work. And so then they started developing the software, and this person was influential in describing how it worked and creating the initial software that was used for it. And then he helped a bunch of other volunteer programmers develop it, and then he just kind of disappeared, I think around 2010. And so he kind of developed it and showed everyone and came up with this sort of innovative thing. And then now no one knows who he is, and he hasn't, no one's heard from him since. And so there's probably a few people who know who he is, but his identity is not known to the public. And so, he released this and kind of created it. And since then, you've had a team of developers who, most of these people, we do know who they are. I mean, there's a person from Google who's working on it, and all sorts of other people who just think it's neat and want to help it, and they volunteer and they develop this software to make it better and make improvements to it.
I mentioned that I heard you give a presentation on this to the local Austin chapter of the ACFE, and why it's become so relevant right now. Why we're hearing about it, why anti-fraud professionals should be aware of it. Kind of tell me why it's popped up in the news so recently, and why it's a bigger deal now than it was maybe in 2009 when it first started.
Yeah, back then hardly anyone knew about it, and then now I think probably the biggest reason that it's become so popular is its skyrocketing value. Back when I first learned about it, it was worth almost nothing, and I wish I would have bought some then, because now I would be a rich man. Because, I mean, when it first started off, a Bitcoin was near valueless. So, to give an example, one of the first classic Bitcoin transactions, someone bought a pizza with 10,000 Bitcoins, just because we didn't know how much they were worth at the time. They didn't seem like they're worth anything, but that's how much he paid for it. And so essentially, a Bitcoin is worth nothing. And so, but as it became more popular, people learned about it, media reports about it, and things like that, and the value kind of started to rise. But then, just imagine if in 2009 you bought, I don't know, like a few dollars worth of Bitcoins, you could have hundreds or thousands of Bitcoins, and now they'd be worth $1,000 each. So, a few people actually have done that. There was a story about a guy who bought some for a research project at school, for a school paper that he was writing, and he just kind of forgot about them. I think he bought $25 worth of Bitcoins, and then he didn't really follow Bitcoins anymore. And then one day, he sees this article, and he says, "Oh, they're worth $600 now, or whatever they were." And so he's like, "Okay, well now I have $700,000."
There's no middleman. It's peer-to-peer. There's no regulation.
There is regulation. There's these kind of choke points for the currency exchangers. That's really where a lot of the activity goes on. That's really where people convert their Bitcoins into dollars and vice versa. And while you can spend them, it's just a lot more practical if you want to cash out your Bitcoins to do it through one of these. And so these entities can be regulated. I mean, they can be regulated kind of like banks. And in fact, some of them have gotten into trouble in the U.S. for not following the requirements. So instead of traditional financial institutions like banks, they're referred to as money services businesses. And so, like MoneyGram and things like that, these are money services businesses. And so these exchangers have been labeled the same thing for legal purposes. And if they don't follow these regulations, then they can be shut down. And what that means is that, if you had an account with them and you wanted to transfer your money through them, well, they wouldn't be able to do it in the U.S. because banks can't accept those payments. It'd be illegal. And it's hard to shut down Bitcoin itself because the network is run by everyone across the world who's using the software. But you can regulate these intermediaries. So I wouldn't say that it's completely unregulated. It's just unregulated in a different way than other payment systems are.
And the transaction from one person to another, is that regulated in any way?
Not really. It's not illegal to use Bitcoins, and I think you could apply some regulations to it. Like if I tried to transfer Bitcoins out of the country past the threshold, so like if you try to transfer $10,000 in cash outside the country, well, you have to report it, right? I'm pretty sure that FinCEN would probably say the same. The Financial Crimes Enforcement Network would probably say the same thing about trying to transfer Bitcoins out of the country. Is that's a currency equivalent, and you would have to report that.
Criminals always seem to find a way to mess up everything. So if they really want to do it, if they really want to hack into something, they hack into something. So if there's this new way of doing something, they're going to find a way to extort it or exploit it. Sorry, they're going to find a way to exploit it. So kind of tell me why it's appealing to fraudsters.
I think the biggest reason is that there is a very high degree of anonymity with Bitcoins. So it's not completely anonymous in the sense that there's no way to trace a transaction back to a person, but it's pretty difficult. And normally you have to, let's say if you're a private investigator, you would probably have to turn to law enforcement to really help you do something like that. When you make a Bitcoin transaction, you either purchase something or you send money to someone else or Bitcoins to someone else. All these transactions are viewable on a public ledger. And so, but it doesn't have, it's kind of like a bank ledger, except it doesn't have the person's actual name. It just has a pseudonym or, a
handle.
A handle. And so you can see what money is going from one address to another. And these addresses are kind of like bank account numbers, except you normally don't keep one after you use it. But so you can see where the money is going, how much money is going, but you don't necessarily know the identity of the person. Now, let's say that if I went home and I had Bitcoins on my computer and I sent them to you, well, they would be able to see what IP address was sending those and receiving those. And so while the average person could not find this. Let's say the government suspected that I was doing something illegal. They could look at my IP address, they could go to the ISP that owns it, and they could figure out who I was with a warrant. And so in that sense, they're not completely anonymous. But there are ways to hide your IP address. So if a criminal is using one of those plus Bitcoin, it has a much higher degree of anonymity than most transactions do. So compared to a credit card transaction, that's tied to an identity. So I think really for money laundering, for moving illicit assets, for stealing funds and things like that, Bitcoin kind of has this advantage over most payment methods, in that if the person knows what they're doing and they know how to hide themselves, it can be quite anonymous. And also, I think for the same reason that it's ideal for people wanting legitimate transactions, is that it's easy to transfer. So I could send a Bitcoin literally to anyone who has an internet connection and can run the Bitcoin software on their devices. And so if, it doesn't matter where they are in the world, if they can connect to the internet through their device and they have the software, I can send them Bitcoins. And there's really nothing that anyone can do to stop me.
Yeah.
And so that ease of transaction and the anonymity, I really think, is why why there's been so many problems in that regard.
So what are some of the schemes that are being carried out using Bitcoin?
One of the most common ways that people steal Bitcoins is just basic cyber theft. So the way that you spend a Bitcoin is it's a number assigned to this address, right? How many Bitcoins are assigned to this address? Well, to spend those Bitcoins, to send them to someone else, you have to have this passkey, and it allows the system to decrypt the transaction and send the funds. And so if someone discovers this passkey, well, they pretty much own those Bitcoins now.
Discover it by hacking into your system?
Yeah, so
Okay.
this passkey, it can be stored on a file on your computer, and if it's not encrypted, if someone can just go onto your computer and find that file, well, now they pretty much have access to all the funds that are in that address. And so they'll hack into a computer and find the passkey and just transfer those funds away from that person.
Okay.
Yeah. And so they just steal it like that. And this has been a pretty big problem for not just individuals, but services that are hosting Bitcoin services. So there's a lot of what we call wallet services. Basically, it's kind of like cloud storage for your Bitcoins. So you kind of trust these people to take care of your Bitcoins. But it turns out a lot of them aren't very good at it. And so they'll have these files on their computers, but someone will hack their systems and get past their security systems, and they'll get access to these files. And these funds aren't insured. I mean, it's not like a bank, where even if someone steals from the bank, you'll probably still get your money back. In these situations, they'll take off with your money, and there's really no recourse for getting that money back. So just straight theft is pretty common. And then you also have a lot of sham services. So people who will offer you a service, and either it's a fake service, like they'll say they're going to do something and then they don't do it, or they'll do the service for a while and then just abscond with all the proceeds. And there's also money laundering is a big problem. Like I said, the anonymity aspect of Bitcoin and the fact that it's very easily transferable has made it a possibility that money laundering is going on there. And so there are services that claim that they can launder your Bitcoins for you. Basically, it's just, there's a website, I don't know if it's still up, but it was called bitcoinlaundry.com, so not just shameful, just we're going to launder your Bitcoins.
What advice do you have for those trying to find out more, or trying to get, a primer, or trying to just get their feet wet and trying to understand this to help their own practice?
Right. One thing that really helped me, there's, like I mentioned, this public ledger, and it's this, where you can view all the transactions that have happened. Well, you can access that ledger at a website called blockchain.info. That's just blockchain.info. So it contains a list of all the transactions that have ever occurred, and you can kind of see how it works. And it has a lot of graphs that you can see, so you can see the value of Bitcoins. It kind of looks like a stock price that goes up and down, or a currency price rather. And so, and that way you can kind of see how you can trace these transactions too. So, it'll have sort of a scrolling bar of all the transactions that are taking place, and it's kind of neat to watch them. It's like so-and-so just transferred 1,000 Bitcoins
in real
to
time?
here. Yeah, in real time. And so you can see these, and you can click on the transaction, and it pops up. It's almost looking like at a bank statement. You can see, the history of this account and where all the money has gone and so forth. And it's really neat to see. And so, once you kind of see that ledger, I think you kind of develop a little bit better understanding of it. As far as understanding the transaction process and how it works, there's a few resources that really help me. The FBI did an intelligence assessment of Bitcoin to kind of explain to some of its members how it works and the threat of it and so forth. And so I don't remember what the title is, but if you type in FBI Bitcoin assessment, you'll find it in a Google search. And there was also a research paper that I found very interesting, and it really laid out, it explained how Bitcoin works sort of in the beginning of it. And it also explained how, it's not as anonymous as some people would have you believe it is. So it kind of breaks down that fear of Bitcoin, saying like, oh, it's this anonymous thing that we can't track at all. But this says, no, actually, if you study the transaction system, you can track it. And that's a research paper called A Fistful of Bitcoins. It was conducted by University of California, San Diego, and George Mason University. So it's freely available on the website.
Well, thank you for joining us today for
Sure.
Fraud Talk. We're going to actually put some of these websites up on our website so you can find them yourself. You can find that and more podcasts at acfe.com/podcast. We will see you next month.